The Skin Collector. The rain fell in relentless sheets, battering the cracked pavement of the city's abandoned industrial district. Neon lights from distant buildings flickered weakly through the downpour, their reflections shimmering in oily puddles that pooled in the uneven ground. Detective Marcus Kane stood at the edge of the cordoned-off alley, his trench coat heavy with rainwater, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the scene. The flashing lights of police cruisers cast long, disjointed shadows across the walls, and the low murmur of officers echoed through the narrow space. Something about this case felt different, even before he saw the body. The air was thick with dread, a palpable tension that made every breath feel heavier, every step more deliberate. He moved closer, the sound of his boots splashing through the water mingling with the distant wail of sirens. The forensic team was already at work, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces pale and drawn. The smell hit him first, a nauseating blend of iron and chemicals that clawed at the back of his throat. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the grotesque tableau at the center of the scene. The body was suspended from a rusted metal frame, its limbs splayed outward like a macabre piece of performance art. The victim's skin had been meticulously removed, leaving raw muscle and sinew exposed, glistening under the artificial light. What made Marcus's stomach turn wasn't just the flaying, it was the way the skin had been displayed. Strips of it hung from the frame, twisted into intricate patterns that resembled some twisted vision of art. The killer had draped the skin over nearby objects, creating a surreal and unsettling scene that felt both calculated and deeply personal. The brutality of the act was shocking, but it was the meticulousness of it that left Marcus unnerved. This wasn't just murder, it was a statement, a deliberate act of terror designed to shock and provoke. The killer wasn't just taking lives, they were crafting something nightmarish, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Officer Dawson, one of the uniformed cops on the scene, stood a few feet away, his face pale and his hands trembling as he clutched his notebook. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Marcus didn't respond. He was too focused on the body, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The victim was a young woman, probably in her late 20s. Her face was unrecognizable, her long hair matted with blood, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her posture, the way her body seemed to hang in silent agony. Marcus felt a pang of sorrow, but it was quickly overshadowed by a cold, growing anger. The forensic team moved in cautiously, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail of the scene. Marcus knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. He scanned the ground for anything the killer might have left behind, a footprint, a cigarette butt, a stray hair, but the scene was disturbingly clean. Whoever had done this was meticulous, experienced, and deliberate. There were no mistakes, no clues left to chance. Marcus's jaw tightened as he realized the enormity of the task ahead. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned and executed act, one that suggested the killer was far from done. As he stood there, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders, Marcus noticed a small piece of paper pinned to the victim's chest. It was soaked with rain, but the words scrawled on it were still legible, "The first canvas." His blood ran cold as he read the message, the implications sinking in. The killer wasn't just taking skin, they were treating their victims as raw materials, as tools to create something horrifying and grotesque. This wasn't just murder, it was an obsession, a twisted form of expression that defied comprehension. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, a reminder of the last case that had nearly destroyed him. The rain continued to fall, washing away any traces of evidence that might have been left behind. Marcus stared at the body, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what little information they had. He needed to identify the victim, to understand how she had ended up here, and to figure out what kind of monster could do something like this. But more than that, he needed to understand the message. Because if he didn't, there would be more bodies, more canvases, and more horrors that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The forensic team worked in silence, their movements methodical and unhurried. Marcus watched them, his thoughts a tangled web of fear and determination. This wasn't just a case, it was a race against time, a desperate attempt to stop a killer who was already steps ahead. The alley felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage, and somewhere out there, the killer was watching, waiting for the next act to begin. Marcus tightened his grip on the plastic evidence bag containing the note, the words, "the first canvas," burning in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the opening move in a deadly game, one that would drag him into the darkest corners of his own past and force him to confront the demons he tried so hard to bury. The dim glow of the precinct's fluorescent lights did little to lift the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the room like a second skin. Detective Marcus Kane sat at his desk, the weight of the case pressing down on him as he stared at the scattered photos and reports spread out before him. The image of the flayed body haunted his thoughts, its grotesque display etched into his mind like a brand. He'd seen death in all its forms over the years, but nothing like this. The brutality was one thing, but the artistry of it, the deliberate, almost obsessive craftsmanship, was something else entirely. It spoke of a mind warped beyond comprehension, a predator who reveled in the fear they instilled. The precinct was quiet, the usual hum of activity muted by the lateness of the hour. Marcus glanced at the clock, the neon numbers glaring back at him. 2:47 a.m. He'd been at it for hours, poring over every detail, every fragment of evidence, searching for something, anything that could give him a lead. But the killer had been meticulous, leaving behind nothing but a note and a body that screamed louder than any words ever could. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. He needed sleep, but he knew rest wouldn't come easily. Not with the case and the ghosts of his past gnawing at the edges of his sanity. His gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk, the one he kept face down most days. It was a picture of him and his wife, taken years ago, before the darkness had crept into their lives and torn them apart. He hesitated, then flipped it over, his heart aching as he looked at her smile, bright and full of life. She'd been his anchor, the one person who could pull him back from the brink when the job threatened to consume him. But that was before the accident, before the guilt and the anger had driven a wedge between them. Now she was gone, and he was left with nothing but regrets and the hollow ache of loss. A sharp knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see his partner, Detective Laura Vega, standing in the doorway. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, her sharp features framed by the harsh light of the hallway. She held 2 steaming cups of coffee in her hands, one of which she placed on his desk without a word. Laura was one of the few people Marcus trusted, her sharp instincts and unwavering determination making her an invaluable partner. But even she looked worn, the weight of the case evident in the shadows under her eyes. "You need to get some rest," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Marcus shook his head, reaching for the coffee. "I'll rest when we catch this bastard," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. Laura sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from him. "You're no good to anyone if you burn yourself out," she said, her tone softening. Marcus knew she was right, but the thought of stopping, even for a moment, made his skin crawl. The killer was out there, and every second they wasted was another second that someone else could become their next victim. Laura reached for one of the photos on the desk, her brow furrowing as she studied the image of the victim. "Any leads?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Nothing concrete," he admitted. "The killer's too careful, too precise. They know what they're doing, and they're not going to make it easy for us." Laura set the photo down, her expression grim. "We'll find them," she said, her voice steady. "We always do." Marcus admired her confidence, even if he didn't share it. This case felt different, the killer's motives shrouded in a layer of madness that defied logic. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal, that the killer was taunting him, daring him to try and stop them. The note, the first canvas, played on a loop in his mind, a chilling reminder that this was only the beginning. He glanced at the clock again, the numbers now reading 3:12 a.m. The night felt endless, the darkness outside the window pressing in like a living thing. "What about the victim?" Laura asked, breaking the silence. "Anything on her yet?" Marcus nodded, pulling a file from the stack on his desk. "Her name's Emily Carter," he said, flipping through the pages. 27 years old, worked as a bartender at a club downtown. No criminal record, no known enemies. Just a regular girl trying to make a living. Laura frowned, her eyes scanning the file. "So why her? What makes her the killer's first choice?" Marcus didn't have an answer, but the question gnawed at him. Why Emily? What had she done or not done to attract the attention of a monster like this? Or was it random, a cruel twist of fate that had placed her in the wrong place at the wrong time? He knew better than to believe in coincidences, especially in a case like this. There had to be a reason, a pattern, a connection that would lead them to the killer. But for now, it was just one more question without an answer. The room fell silent again, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting back to the scene in the alley. The way the skin had been displayed with such care, such precision. It was as if the killer was trying to send a message, to communicate something that went beyond words. But what? And who was the audience? Marcus had a sinking feeling that he was part of it, that the killer was playing a game with him, testing his limits, pushing him to the edge. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "We'll figure it out," she said, her tone firm. "But we can't do it if you're running on empty. Get some rest, Marcus. The case will still be here in the morning." He knew she was right, but the thought of leaving, of turning his back on the case even for a few hours, felt like a betrayal. Still, he nodded, knowing he couldn't keep going like this. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, the weight of the case settled over him like a shroud. This was only the beginning, and he knew the road ahead would be long and treacherous. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He glanced at Laura, gratitude flickering in the back of his mind. She was his partner, his ally, and together they would face whatever horrors awaited them. The city was shrouded in a thick, oppressive fog, the kind that swallowed sound and light, leaving the streets eerily quiet and cloaked in uneasy stillness. Marcus stood at the edge of the park, his breath visible in the cold air as he surveyed the scene before him. The second victim had been found just before dawn, their body discovered by a jogger who had stumbled upon the grotesque display. Fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, but Marcus didn't need to get close to know what awaited him. The familiar stench of blood and chemicals hung heavy in the air, a sickening confirmation that the killer had struck again. The forensic team was already at work, their movements slow and deliberate as they documented the scene. Marcus stepped closer, his boots crunching against the frost-covered grass, his heart pounding in his chest. The body was suspended from a tree, its skin removed and draped over the branches in a grotesque imitation of foliage. The killer had outdone themselves this time, the display more elaborate, more horrifying than the first. The victim's raw muscle and sinew gleamed in the pale light of the morning, the bloodied branches above them swaying gently in the breeze. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he took it all in. The victim was a man this time, his face unrecognizable, his body contorted in a way that suggested he had been alive during the flaying. Marcus clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. He had seen his share of horrors, but this was something else entirely. The killer was escalating, their work more refined, more calculated. It was as if they were testing their own limits, pushing themselves to create something even more twisted and grotesque. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a taunt aimed directly at him. Officer Dawson was standing nearby, his face pale and his hands trembling as he tried to keep his breakfast down. Marcus didn't blame him. This wasn't the kind of thing anyone could get used to, no matter how long they'd been on the job. Dawson approached hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Detective, we found something," he said, holding out a small evidence bag. Inside was another note, the handwriting the same as the first, the second canvas. Marcus stared at it, his stomach churning. The killer was keeping count, treating each victim like a piece in a demented collection. Marcus turned his attention back to the body, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what little information they had. The victim was a middle-aged man, his build muscular, his hands calloused from years of manual labor. He wasn't from the city. The clothes he wore were too plain, too practical for someone who lived in the bustling metropolis. Marcus felt a pang of sorrow for the man, whoever he was. He had been someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. And now he was nothing more than a canvas for a killer's twisted art project. The forensic team moved in cautiously, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail of the scene. Marcus knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. He scanned the ground for anything the killer might have left behind: a footprint, a stray hair, a piece of fabric, but once again, the scene was disturbingly clean. Whoever had done this was meticulous, experienced, and deliberate. There were no mistakes, no clues left to chance. Marcus's jaw tightened as he realized the enormity of the task ahead. As he stood there, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders, Marcus noticed something on the victim's chest. It was a small, circular mark, barely visible amidst the raw flesh. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding as he realized what it was: a brand. The killer had marked their victim, a twisted signature that sent chills down his spine. It was a deliberate act, a way of claiming ownership, and Marcus knew it was a message meant for him. The killer was taunting him, challenging him to try and stop them. The fog lingered, wrapping the scene in an eerie silence that felt almost suffocating. Marcus stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Why this victim? What connected him to the first? Was there a pattern, a motive, or was the killer choosing their victims at random? Marcus didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be the last time he'd see something like this. The killer was just getting started, and Marcus had to find them before they struck again. Laura arrived a few minutes later, her face pale as she took in the scene. She didn't say anything, but Marcus could see the horror in her eyes. She approached him slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we dealing with here, Marcus?" she asked, her tone heavy with dread. He shook his head, his voice grim. "Someone who knows exactly what they're doing," he said, "and they're not going to stop until we stop them." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Marcus knew they were running out of time, that every moment they wasted was another moment the killer had to plan their next move. But he also knew they couldn't rush this. The killer was too careful, too precise. They needed to be smarter, faster, and more relentless if they were going to bring them down. As the forensic team continued their work, Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest. This case was different, the darkness of it seeping into his soul in a way he hadn't felt in years. He knew it wasn't just the brutality of the crimes. It was the way the killer seemed to be speaking directly to him, like they knew his secrets, his fears, his weaknesses. It was a game, and Marcus had no choice but to play. The fog began to lift as the sun rose, casting the park in a pale, golden light. But the brightness of the morning did nothing to dispel the shadows that clung to the scene. Marcus stood there for a long time, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of the case. He didn't know it yet, but the killer was watching, waiting for the next act to begin. And Marcus had a sinking feeling that he was running out of time. The room was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead casting long shadows across the walls. Marcus sat at the small wooden table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his knuckles white from the pressure. Across from him sat the victim's family, Emily Carter's parents, their faces drawn and tear-streaked, their grief palpable in the heavy silence. It was the part of the job he hated most, the part that never got easier no matter how many times he had to do it. Telling someone their loved one was gone, that they had been taken in the most brutal and senseless way possible, always left a hollow ache in his chest. Emily's father, a burly man with weathered hands and a face hardened by years of labor, stared at the table, his jaw clenched as he struggled to hold back his tears. Her mother, a petite woman with soft features and graying hair, clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. "I'm sorry for your loss," he began, the words feeling inadequate even as he said them. "I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to find the person responsible." The room fell silent again, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Emily's mother looked up, her eyes filled with a desperate hope that made Marcus's stomach churn. "Do you have any leads?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We're following every possible angle," he said, avoiding the question. He couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth that they had no leads, that the killer was slipping through their fingers like smoke, leaving behind nothing but carnage and questions. Emily's father slammed his fist on the table, the sudden noise making Marcus flinch. "She was just a kid," he growled, his voice thick with anger and pain. "She didn't deserve this. No one does." Marcus nodded, his chest tight with guilt and frustration. He wanted to promise them justice, to tell them he would stop the killer before they could hurt anyone else. But the words caught in his throat, the weight of the case pressing down on him like a crushing weight. "Do you have any idea why someone would do this to her?" Emily's mother asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We're still trying to figure that out," he admitted, hating how inadequate it sounded. "But I promise you, we won't stop until we find the person responsible." He meant it every word, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not for them, and not for Emily. The meeting ended shortly after, the room heavy with unspoken grief and anger. Marcus watched as Emily's parents left, their shoulders slumped, their steps slow and heavy. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing he had failed them, that he hadn't been able to give them the answers they deserved. He sat there for a long time, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the case, to find something, anything that could give them a lead. Laura found him there an hour later, her expression soft with concern. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus shook his head, his voice heavy with frustration. "They deserved better," he said, his tone grim. "They deserved answers, and I couldn't give them that." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "We'll find them, Marcus," she said, her voice firm. "But you can't blame yourself for this. You're doing everything you can." Marcus knew she was right, but it didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. The killer was out there, and every moment they wasted was another moment that someone else could become their next victim. He stood up, his resolve hardening. "We need to figure out the connection between the victims," he said. "There has to be something that ties them together. Something we're missing." Laura nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "I've been going through their backgrounds," she said, opening a folder and spreading the contents across the table. Emily worked at a club downtown. The second victim, John Harper, was a construction worker who lived on the outskirts of the city. On the surface, they don't seem to have anything in common. Marcus frowned, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of information. What about their social circles? Friends, family, co-workers? Maybe there's a connection there. Laura shook her head. "We've already checked. There's no overlap that we can find." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his frustration mounting. "There has to be something," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "We're missing something." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, the ghosts of his past whispering in the back of his mind. He knew he couldn't let this case consume him, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. "We'll figure it out," Laura said, her voice steady. "But you need to take care of yourself, too. You're no good to anyone if you're running on empty." Marcus nodded, knowing she was right. But the thought of stopping, even for a moment, made his skin crawl. The killer was out there, and every second counted. The rain had returned, a steady drizzle that soaked through Marcus's jacket as he stood at the edge of the crime scene. The third victim had been found in an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the location as desolate and forgotten as the building itself. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, the shadows deep and impenetrable in the dim light of the flashlights. The body was suspended from the ceiling, its skin removed and arranged in intricate patterns across the floor below. The killer's work was becoming more elaborate, more grotesque, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he took in the horrific scene. The victim was a woman this time, her body lithe and athletic, her face unrecognizable beneath the ragged, raw flesh. Marcus stepped closer, his boots crunching against the debris-covered floor, his heart pounding in his chest. The killer had been meticulous, the patterns on the floor resembling some twisted form of art. It was as if they were trying to create something beautiful out of something horrifying, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a taunt aimed directly at him. The forensic team moved in cautiously, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail of the scene. Marcus knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. He scanned the ground for anything the killer might have left behind: a footprint, a stray hair, a piece of fabric, but once again, the scene was disturbingly clean. Whoever had done this was meticulous, experienced, and deliberate. There were no mistakes, no clues left to chance. Marcus's jaw tightened as he realized the enormity of the task ahead. As he stood there, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders, Marcus noticed something on the victim's chest. It was a small, circular mark, barely visible amidst the raw flesh. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding as he realized what it was: a brand. The killer had marked their victim, a twisted signature that sent chills down his spine. It was a deliberate act, a way of claiming ownership, and Marcus knew it was a message meant for him. The killer was taunting him, challenging him to try and stop them. The warehouse was silent except for the soft murmur of the forensic team and the distant sound of rain hitting the roof. Marcus stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Why this victim? What connected her to the others? Was there a pattern, a motive, or was the killer choosing their victims at random? Marcus didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be the last time he'd see something like this. The killer was just getting started, and Marcus had to find them before they struck again. Laura arrived a few minutes later, her face pale as she took in the scene. She didn't say anything, but Marcus could see the horror in her eyes. She approached him slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we dealing with here, Marcus?" she asked, her tone heavy with dread. He shook his head, his voice grim. "Someone who knows exactly what they're doing," he said, "and they're not going to stop until we stop them." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Marcus knew they were running out of time, that every moment they wasted was another moment the killer had to plan their next move. But he also knew they couldn't rush this. The killer was too careful, too precise. They needed to be smarter, faster, and more relentless if they were going to bring them down. As the forensic team continued their work, Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest. This case was different, the darkness of it seeping into his soul in a way he hadn't felt in years. He knew it wasn't just the brutality of the crimes. It was the way the killer seemed to be speaking directly to him, like they knew his secrets, his fears, his weaknesses. It was a game, and Marcus had no choice but to play. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, the sound of it drowning out the murmur of voices in the warehouse. Marcus stared at the body, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of the case. The killer was escalating, their work more refined, more calculated. It was as if they were testing their own limits, pushing themselves to create something even more twisted and grotesque. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a taunt aimed directly at him. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "We'll figure it out," she said, her tone firm. "But we can't do it if you're running on empty. Get some rest, Marcus. The case will still be here in the morning." He knew she was right, but the thought of leaving, of turning his back on the case even for a few hours, felt like a betrayal. Still, he nodded, knowing he couldn't keep going like this. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, the weight of the case settled over him like a shroud. This was only the beginning, and he knew the road ahead would be long and treacherous. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He glanced at Laura, gratitude flickering in the back of his mind. She was his partner, his ally, and together they would face whatever horrors awaited them. The rain continued to fall, washing away any traces of evidence that might have been left behind. Marcus stared at the body, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what little information they had. He didn't know it yet, but the killer was watching, waiting for the next act to begin. And Marcus had a sinking feeling that he was running out of time. The precinct's break room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the case, its fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead and the faint smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Marcus sat at one of the small tables, a steaming cup in his hands, though he couldn't bring himself to take a sip. His thoughts were consumed by the case, the faces of the victims haunting him like ghosts he couldn't shake. Laura sat across from him, her own cup untouched, her expression thoughtful as she flipped through a stack of notes. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything they didn't yet understand. Laura was the first to speak, her voice breaking through the quiet like a lifeline. "We need to look at this differently," she said, her tone steady. "The killer's leaving us clues, but we're not seeing them. There's a pattern here, something we're missing." Marcus looked up, his brow furrowing. "A pattern?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What kind of pattern?" Laura leaned forward, her eyes intense. "The way they're displaying the bodies, the markings, the notes, it's all part of a narrative. The killer's telling a story, and we need to figure out what it is." Marcus considered her words, the idea taking root in his mind. He'd been so focused on the brutality of the crimes that he hadn't stopped to consider the possibility that there was more to it. The killer wasn't just killing. They were creating, crafting something that went beyond mere violence. It was a chilling thought, but one that made sense. "So what's the story?" he asked, his voice low. Laura shook her head. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But if we can figure it out, we might be able to predict their next move." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Marcus felt a spark of hope, the first he'd felt in days. If they could understand the killer's motives, their patterns, they might have a chance of stopping them before they struck again. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We need to go back to the beginning," he said, his voice firm. "Re-examine everything. There's something we're not seeing, something that connects the victims." Laura nodded, her expression determined. "I'll start with the first victim," she said. "You take the second. We'll compare notes and see if we can find a link." Marcus agreed, his mind already racing through the details of the second victim's life. John Harper had been a construction worker, a man with no criminal record, no known enemies. But there had to be something, some thread that connected him to Emily Carter and the third victim, a woman named Sarah Mitchell. As they worked, the hours slipped away, the break room growing quieter as the night wore on. Marcus pored over the files, his eyes scanning every detail, every line, searching for something, anything that could give them a lead. But the more he looked, the more frustrated he became. The victims seemed to have nothing in common, their lives as different as night and day. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face, the exhaustion creeping in. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "I think I found something," she said, her tone cautious. Marcus looked up, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Laura handed him a sheet of paper, her eyes filled with a mix of excitement and dread. "The victims all visited the same clinic," she said. "A free clinic on the east side of the city." Marcus stared at the paper, his mind racing. The clinic was a small, nondescript building tucked away in a rundown neighborhood, the kind of place that catered to people who couldn't afford regular health care. It was a long shot, but it was something. "When?" he asked, his voice urgent. Laura frowned. "All within the last 6 months," she said. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, the first in days. "We need to talk to the staff," he said. "Find out who was working there, who the victims interacted with. There's a connection here, and we're going to find it." The two stood up, the fatigue of the long night momentarily forgotten as they prepared to follow the new lead. Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination, the weight of the case lifting ever so slightly. They had a thread to pull on, and he wasn't going to let it go. The killer had made a mistake, and Marcus was going to make them pay for it. As they left the precinct and headed for the clinic, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally getting closer. The killer had been careful, but everyone made mistakes eventually, and Marcus was going to make sure this one cost them everything. The clinic was a small, unassuming building nestled in the heart of a neglected neighborhood, its faded sign barely visible beneath layers of grime. Marcus stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic and bleach assaulting his senses as he scanned the cramped waiting area. Faded posters about flu shots and STD awareness lined the walls, and a handful of patients sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their eyes downcast as they waited for their turn. Laura followed close behind, her expression focused as she took in the surroundings. The receptionist, a weary-looking woman in her 50s, glanced up from her computer, her eyes narrowing as she recognized them as outsiders. Marcus approached the counter, his badge held up for her to see. "We're looking for information about some patients who were treated here," he said, his tone polite but firm. The receptionist's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We don't give out patient information without a warrant," she said, her tone clipped. Laura stepped forward, her voice calm but insistent. "We're investigating a series of murders," she said. "The victims were all patients here. We're just trying to find out who might have had contact with them." The receptionist hesitated, her eyes flicking between them as she weighed her options. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Wait here," she said, turning to unlock a drawer behind the counter. She pulled out a weathered ledger, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from years of use. "This is our patient log," she said, sliding it across the counter. "It goes back about a year. But you didn't get this from me, understand?" Marcus nodded, his gratitude unspoken as he flipped open the ledger and began scanning the names. The search was tedious, the entries cramped and barely legible, but Marcus and Laura worked methodically, cross-referencing the names with the victims' records. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. All 3 victims had visited the clinic within the last 6 months, their names scrawled in the same messy handwriting. Marcus felt a spark of hope as he noted the dates, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the timeline. There was something here, something they were missing. Laura tapped a finger on the ledger, her expression thoughtful. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a name next to one of the entries. "Dr. Edwin Hayes. He was the attending physician for all 3 victims." Marcus's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as he absorbed the information. "We need to talk to him," he said, his voice tight with urgency. The receptionist, who had been watching them nervously, shook her head. "Dr. Hayes doesn't work here anymore," she said. "He left about 3 months ago." The sense of unease in Marcus's chest deepened as he exchanged a glance with Laura. The timing was too coincidental, the connection too strong to ignore. "Do you know where he went?" Laura asked, her voice steady. The receptionist shrugged. "No idea," he said. "He didn't say. Just handed in his resignation and left." Marcus frowned, his mind racing. Dr. Hayes had treated all 3 victims, and now he was gone. It was a lead, but it was also a dead end if they couldn't find him. The 2 left the clinic, the weight of the new information pressing down on them as they stepped out into the cold morning air. Marcus felt a mix of frustration and determination, the puzzle pieces of the case slowly starting to come together. "We need to find Hayes," he said, his voice grim. "He's the key to this. I can feel it." Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'll put out an APB," she said. "If he's still in the city, we'll find him." As they drove back to the precinct, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally closing in. The killer had been meticulous, but they had left a trail, and Marcus was determined to follow it to the end. The thought of finally catching them filled him with a sense of purpose, but it was tempered by the knowledge that time was running out. Every moment they wasted was another moment the killer had to plan their next move. The precinct was bustling by the time they arrived, the noise and chaos a stark contrast to the quiet of the clinic. Marcus and Laura moved quickly, their steps purposeful as they headed for their desks. The search for Dr. Hayes was already underway, the precinct's resources mobilized in a way that only a high-profile case could inspire. Marcus felt a flicker of hope as he sat down at his desk, the weight of the case momentarily lifting as he focused on the task at hand. As he sifted through the information they had gathered, Marcus's mind kept returning to the clinic, the eerie connection between the victims and Dr. Hayes. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him, something that felt off. The killer's meticulousness, their attention to detail, it all pointed to someone with medical knowledge, someone who understood the human body in a way that went beyond the average person. Hayes fit the profile, but Marcus knew better than to jump to conclusions. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "We've got a lead," she said, her tone filled with cautious optimism. "A former co-worker of Hayes's says he might have gone to stay with his sister in a nearby town. I'm sending a team to check it out. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the break they'd been waiting for. If they could find Hayes, they might finally be able to stop the killer before they struck again. As they prepared to follow the lead, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. The killer had been playing a twisted game, but Marcus was ready to turn the tables. He didn't know what they would find when they tracked down Hayes, but he knew one thing for certain: the end was in sight. The drive to the neighboring town was a tense one, the quiet hum of the engine doing little to ease the tension in the car. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he tried to focus on the task at hand. Laura sat beside him, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with the team that had already been sent ahead. The lead on Dr. Hayes was solid, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The killer had been one step ahead of them this entire time, and Marcus wasn't about to let his guard down now. The town itself was small and sleepy, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It didn't take long to find the house where Hayes' sister lived, a modest two-story home with a well-kept yard and a white picket fence. Marcus parked a few houses down, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The house looked quiet, almost too quiet, but Marcus knew better than to trust appearances. Laura stepped out of the car, her hand resting on the grip of her holstered weapon as they approached the house. Marcus followed close behind, his senses on high alert as they walked up the driveway. The front door was slightly ajar, the sight sending a chill down Marcus's spine. He exchanged a glance with Laura, the unspoken agreement between them clear. Something was wrong. They stepped inside cautiously, the entryway dimly lit and eerily silent. The house was immaculate, the furniture neatly arranged and the floors spotless, but there was an underlying tension in the air that made Marcus's skin crawl. He moved further into the house, his eyes scanning every corner for any sign of movement. The stillness was unnerving, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. The first body was in the kitchen, a woman slumped over the table with a single gunshot wound to the head. Marcus recognized her immediately from the photos they'd seen Hayes' sister. His stomach churned as he stepped closer, the bile rising in his throat as he took in the scene. The killer had been here, and they hadn't been subtle about it. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Marcus," Laura's voice called out from the living room, her tone urgent. He followed the sound, his heart pounding as he stepped into the room. Hayes was there, tied to a chair with his head slumped forward, his face pale and lifeless. The sight sent a jolt of panic through Marcus, his mind racing as he rushed to check for a pulse. There was none. Hayes was dead, his body still warm to the touch. Marcus stepped back, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The killer had beaten them here, and not by much. They had been close, so close, but the killer had slipped through their fingers once again. The frustration was almost unbearable, the weight of the case pressing down on him like a crushing force. Laura stood beside him, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "They're taunting us," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "They knew we'd come here. They wanted us to see this." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the truth of her words. The killer was playing with them, toying with them, and Marcus was tired of being the puppet in this twisted game. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the silence, the backup team finally arriving. Marcus stepped outside, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what had happened. Killer had been here, but where had they gone? And more importantly, what was their next move? As the forensic team began their work, Marcus felt a sense of determination settle over him. The killer had made a mistake coming here, leaving behind more than just bodies. There had to be a clue, something they could use to track them down. Marcus wasn't going to let this case consume him. But he also wasn't going to stop until he brought the killer to justice. The thought of the victims, their families, and the pain they had endured fueled Marcus's resolve. The killer thought they were untouchable, but Marcus was going to prove them wrong. He glanced at Laura, her expression mirroring his determination. Together, they would find the killer, and they would make them pay. The forensic team worked through the night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they meticulously documented the scene. Marcus stood in the doorway of the living room, his arms crossed as he watched them work, the weight of the case pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The killer had been here, had left their mark, and yet it felt like they had vanished into thin air. The frustration gnawed at him, a constant ache in the back of his mind that refused to let him rest. Laura stood beside him, her hands in her pockets as she scanned the room, her eyes narrowed in thought. "They knew we'd come here," she said, her voice low. "They wanted us to find this." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah," he said. "They're messing with us, trying to throw us off their trail." The thought was infuriating, the killer's arrogance only serving to fuel his determination. They were close, he could feel it, but the killer was always one step ahead. One of the forensic techs approached them, holding a small evidence bag in her gloved hand. "We found this in the kitchen," she said, holding it up for them to see. Inside the bag was a piece of paper, neatly folded and covered in handwriting. Marcus took it, his heart racing as he unfolded it and read the words scrawled across the page. "You're running out of time," it read, the letters jagged and hurried. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, the paper crumpling in his grip. Laura took the note from him, her eyes scanning the words as she frowned. "They're not just taunting us," she said. "They're giving us a deadline." Marcus nodded, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the killer's message. What did they mean by running out of time? What were they planning, and how much time did they have to stop it? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The two left the house and headed back to the car, the weight of the killer's message heavy on their shoulders. The night was cold, the wind biting as it whipped through the trees, but Marcus barely felt it. His mind was consumed by the case, the urgency of the situation driving him forward. They needed to find the killer, and they needed to do it fast. As they drove back to the precinct, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw the message on the screen. Another body had been found. The killer had struck again, and this time they hadn't been subtle. Marcus cursed under his breath, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he steered the car onto the highway. The fourth victim had been left in a public park, their body displayed in a grotesque tableau that was impossible to ignore. The park was cordoned off, the flashing lights of the police cars illuminating the scene as Marcus and Laura stepped out of the car. The body was suspended from a tree, the skin removed and arranged in intricate patterns on the ground below. It was a horrifying sight, one that left Marcus feeling sick to his stomach. The killer's message was clear. They weren't going to stop, and they weren't going to hide. They were escalating, their work becoming more brazen and more public. Marcus scanned the scene, his eyes landing on a small object placed carefully at the base of the tree. It was a clock, its hands frozen in place, the time set to midnight. The symbolism was unmistakable. Time was running out. Laura stepped forward, her expression grim as she examined the clock. "They're not just killing," she said. "They're sending a message. And they want everyone to see it." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the truth of her words. The killer was playing a game, but it wasn't just with them, it was with the entire city. As the forensic team worked to process the scene, Marcus felt a growing sense of urgency. They were running out of time, and the killer knew it. The clock wasn't just a taunt, it was a warning, a countdown to something terrible. Marcus didn't know what the killer had planned, But he knew one thing for certain. They needed to stop them before it was too late. The two left the park, the weight of the case heavier than ever. The killer wasn't just a murderer, they were a monster, one that needed to be stopped at all costs. Marcus glanced at Laura, her expression mirroring his determination. Together, they would find the killer, and they would end this nightmare once and for all. The precinct was in chaos, the fourth victim's discovery sending shockwaves through the department. Marcus and Laura stood in the center of the storm, their faces set in grim determination as they tried to piece together the killer's next move. The clock had been a clear message, but what it meant was still anyone's guess. Theories flew around the room, each more unsettling than the last, but Marcus knew they couldn't afford to waste time on speculation. They needed answers, and they needed them now. Laura leaned over a map of the city that had been spread across a table, her finger tracing the locations of the victims. "There's a pattern here," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "The park, the clinic, the house, they're all connected, but we're missing the link." Marcus studied the map, his mind racing as he tried to see what Laura was seeing. The location seemed random at first glance, but he knew better than to dismiss the possibility of a pattern. The ringing of a phone broke through the noise, the sound sharp and insistent. Marcus grabbed it, his voice tight as he answered. "Detective Kane," he said, the line crackling with static. The caller's voice was distorted, deliberate, sending a chill down Marcus's spine. "You're running out of time," they said, the words echoing the note they'd found at the house. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead before he could get an answer. Laura watched him, her expression darkening as she absorbed what had just happened. "That was them, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice tight. Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched as he slammed the phone back into its cradle. "They're toying with us," he said, his voice low and angry. "They're trying to throw us off our game." Laura shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "No," she said. "They're giving us a clue. They want us to figure this out, but they're making us work for it." Marcus frowned, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the killer's twisted logic. If they were leaving clues, then there had to be a reason. They were playing a game, but Marcus wasn't interested in playing along. He needed to crack the code, to beat the killer at their own game. The clock was ticking, and every second they wasted brought them closer to disaster. The two worked through the night, poring over the evidence and trying to find the missing piece of the puzzle. The victims' lives, the locations, the messages, they all had to connect somehow. Marcus's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he pushed through the exhaustion, his determination unwavering. They were so close, he could feel it, but the killer's twisted mind was proving harder to unravel than he'd anticipated. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Laura let out a sharp exhale, her eyes locking onto something in the case files. "Marcus," she said, her voice urgent, "look at this." He stepped closer, his heart racing as he saw what she was pointing at. All four victims had attended the same support group, a small, informal gathering for people dealing with chronic pain. It was a thread, a connection that hadn't been there before. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications. The support group met every week at a community center, a place that hadn't been on their radar before. If the victims had all been members, then the killer could have been watching them, learning about them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The thought sent a chill down Marcus's spine, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The community center was their next lead, the only clue they had left. The killer's game was coming to a head, and Marcus knew they couldn't afford to miss their opportunity. The clock was still ticking, the message clear, they were running out of time. Marcus grabbed his coat, his resolve hardening as he headed for the door. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. As they drove through the city, the tension in the car was palpable. Marcus's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road as he tried to push back the rising sense of dread. The killer was out there, watching, waiting, and Marcus wasn't going to let them win. They were close, too close to let it all slip away now. The community center was a modest building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its unassuming appearance belying the storm that was brewing inside. Marcus and Laura stepped out of the car, their weapons drawn as they approached the entrance. The air was thick with tension, the silence unnerving as they stepped inside. The killer was here, Marcus could feel it, and this time they weren't going to escape. As they moved through the building, Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his senses on high alert. The killer's game was about to end, and Marcus was ready to finish it. They had come too far to turn back now, and he wasn't going to let the clock run out. The Bone Carver. The village of Black Hollow clung to the edge of the sea like a barnacle, weathered and forgotten by time. Its narrow, winding streets were lined with crooked, moss-covered cottages, their windows darkened by salt and age. The air smelled of brine and decay, a constant reminder of the village's isolation. Jonah had walked for days to reach this place, his boots worn thin, his cloak heavy with rain. He had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape the shadows that had haunted him for years. Black Hollow seemed as good a place as any to disappear, though the weight of the village's silence felt heavier than any he'd encountered. The villagers eyed him with suspicion as he trudged through the muddy streets. Strangers were rare here, and trust was scarcer. Jonah kept his head down, his hood pulled low over his face, but he could feel their gazes like cold fingers tracing his spine. He stopped at the local tavern, a ramshackle building with a creaking sign that read The Salty Anchor. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale ale and wood smoke. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, their whispers falling silent as Jonah approached the bar, his presence an unwelcome intrusion. The barkeeper, a burly man with a patchy beard, eyed Jonah with unconcealed distrust. "What brings you to Black Hollow?" he asked, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. Jonah hesitated, his mind racing for a plausible excuse. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice low and weary. The barkeeper grunted, clearly unsatisfied, but poured him a mug of ale anyway. Jonah took a sip, the bitter liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled in his bones. The man's gaze lingered a moment too long before he turned away, muttering something under his breath. As he sat in the corner of the tavern, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The villagers' whispers grew louder, their glances more frequent. He caught fragments of their conversation: stranger, bad luck, the storm. One word stood out among the rest: Carver. It sent a shiver down his spine, though he didn't know why. He finished his ale quickly and asked the barkeeper for a room. "We don't get many visitors," the man said, handing him a rusty key. "You'll be in the loft. Don't cause trouble." The phrase felt more like a threat than a warning. The loft was cold and drafty, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot. Jonah dropped his pack and sat on the thin, lumpy mattress, rubbing his tired eyes. The sound of the wind outside was unnerving, a mournful wail that seemed to echo his own restless thoughts. He lay down, but sleep eluded him. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and pulse, as if they were alive. He told himself it was just the flickering candlelight, but the unease in his gut refused to fade. The air itself felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. Hours passed, and the village fell into an uneasy silence. Jonah was on the brink of sleep when a distant scream shattered the stillness. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The scream was cut short, leaving an eerie void in its wake. He grabbed his cloak and hurried downstairs, but the tavern was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers. Outside, The streets were deserted, the fog so thick it swallowed the light from the flickering street lamps. Another sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like metal against bone. It came from the direction of the docks. Jonah hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He knew he should stay out of trouble, but the scream weighed heavily on his conscience. He followed the sound, his footsteps muffled by the fog. The docks were shrouded in darkness, the waves lapping against the wooden pilings. As he drew closer, the scraping stopped. He froze, the silence pressing in on him like a suffocating weight. Then he saw it, a figure hunched over something on the ground. Jonah took a step forward, and the figure turned its head. Its eyes glowed like twin embers in the dark. The figure disappeared into the fog, leaving Jonah alone on the docks. He approached the spot where it had been crouching and felt his stomach churn. There, lying on the ground, was the body of a fisherman. His chest had been carved open, his ribs pulled apart to form a grotesque sculpture. The bones were polished to a sickening sheen, their edges sharp and precise. Jonah stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. He had seen death before, but nothing like this. The macabre artistry was both horrifying and mesmerizing, a testament to a mind unhinged. As he stared at the body, Jonah realized that the villagers' whispers had been a warning. Something dark and twisted lurked in Black Hollow, and now it had his attention. He turned and ran back to the tavern, his heart racing. The loft suddenly felt like a trap, the shadows closing in around him. He knew he should leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was the same curiosity that had always led him into trouble. Whatever it was, Jonah knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave until he found out what or who was behind the carvings. The night stretched on, endless and restless. Jonah sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. The fisherman's mutilated body was burned into his memory, every detail vivid and unshakable. He thought about the figure he'd seen, its glowing eyes and unnatural movements. It wasn't human, he was sure of that. But what was it? And why had it chosen Black Hollow as its hunting ground? The questions gnawed at him, leaving him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. Sleep was impossible now. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. When dawn finally broke, the village stirred to life, though the usual chatter was muted. Jonah descended the stairs to find the tavern filled with hushed voices and furtive glances. The barkeeper looked up as he approached, his expression grim. "Didn't sleep well, eh?" he asked, his tone almost accusatory. Jonah shook his head, his throat too dry to speak. The barkeeper poured him a glass of water and leaned in close. "Something's been prowling the village," he muttered. "Bad things happen when it's here." Jonah's hands tightened around the glass. "What is it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The barkeeper hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "They call it the bone carver," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's an old story, one we'd hoped was just a tale. But now," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on Jonah, "you should leave while you still can. It's not safe here." Jonah set the glass down, his mind reeling. He had come to Black Hollow to escape the past, but it seemed the past had followed him, or worse, it had found him. He didn't respond, but the barkeeper's warning echoed in his mind. The bone carver was real, and Jonah was now tangled in its web. The morning sun did little to dispel the gloom that hung over Black Hollow. The villagers moved through the streets with their heads down. Their footsteps hurried and their voices hushed. Jonah wandered aimlessly, his mind still reeling from the horror he'd witnessed the night before. The fisherman's body had been taken away before dawn, but the memory of it lingered like a stain on the village. He could feel the weight of the villagers' stares as he passed, their distrust palpable. It was clear they blamed him, the stranger, for the nightmare that had descended upon them. Jonah found himself drawn to the docks, despite the dread that churned in his stomach. The area was cordoned off with frayed rope, but no one stood guard. The fog had lifted, revealing the jagged edges of the wooden planks and the restless sea beyond. He crouched down near the spot where the body had lain, his fingers brushing against the dark stains soaked into the wood. The air smelled of salt and iron, a metallic tang that made his stomach turn. He wondered what kind of creature or person could commit such an atrocity, and why they had chosen this place. The sound of footsteps behind him made Jonah tense. He turned to see a woman approaching, her expression wary but determined. She was older, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. "You're the drifter," she said, her voice low but steady. Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone guarded. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flickering to the bloodstains on the dock. "My name is Ira," she said finally. "I knew the fisherman. His name was Tomas. He didn't deserve this." Jonah stood, studying her carefully. "Do you know who did this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ira shook her head, her eyes distant. "No one knows for sure," she said. "But it's not the first time. Years ago, something like this happened. They called it the bone carver. It vanished as suddenly as it appeared, but the fear stayed with us." Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tight. Ira met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because you're involved now, whether you like it or not. And if you're going to survive, you'll need to understand what you're up against." The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease and suspicion. Jonah wandered the village, his presence drawing wary glances and hushed whispers. He tried to piece together what little information he had, but it only left him with more questions. The bone carver was more than just a murderer, it was a legend, a story passed down through generations. But how much of it was true? And why had it returned now? Jonah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the tavern. He hurried over to find a crowd gathered, their faces etched with fear and anger. At the center of the crowd was a man Jonah recognized as one of the fishermen. He was holding up a piece of bone, carved into an intricate shape that resembled a ship. "It was in my house," the man shouted, his voice trembling. "It wasn't there last night. It just appeared." The villagers murmured among themselves, their fear palpable. Jonah pushed his way through the crowd, his heart pounding. "Let me see that," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The man hesitated, then handed him the bone. It was smooth and cold to the touch, its edges sharp and precise. Jonah's stomach churned as he realized what it was, a piece of Tomas. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers growing louder as they retreated to their homes. Jonah stood there, the bone carving in his hand, feeling the weight of the village's fear pressing down on him. He knew he was being watched, though he couldn't tell by whom. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the bone carver was closer than anyone realized. He tucked the carving into his pocket and headed back to the tavern, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them by hiding. The tavern was eerily quiet when Jonah returned. The barkeeper was wiping down the bar, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced up as Jonah approached, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone curt. Jonah hesitated, then pulled out the bone carving and placed it on the counter. The barkeeper's eyes widened, but he didn't touch it. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Jonah explained about the fishermen and the crowd, but the barkeeper's expression only darkened. "You shouldn't have taken it," he said. "It's a bad omen. Leave it be." Jonah scoffed, frustration boiling over. "Leave it be? People are dying, and you're talking about omens? Tell me what you know about the bone carver." The barkeeper hesitated, his gaze flickering to the carving. "It's an old story," he said finally. "They say it's a spirit, cursed to wander these lands. It carves bones as a way to mark its victims, to show that they belong to it. No one knows why it chooses certain people, but once it does, there's no escape." Jonah leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Is it real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The barkeeper looked away. "It's real enough to kill." The conversation left Jonah more unsettled than before. He retreated to the loft, the bone carving heavy in his pocket. The room felt colder than usual, the shadows deeper. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. The bone carver wasn't just a killer, it was something more, something ancient and malevolent. And it had marked him, whether he realized it or not. He thought about leaving, running as far as he could, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The bone carver would find him, just as it had found Tomas and the others. He was trapped, and the only way out was to fight. That night, the wind howled outside, the sound like a lament for the dead. Jonah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts consumed by the bone carver. He thought about the carving in his pocket, the way it fit perfectly in his hand, as if it had been made for him. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message, a warning of what was to come. Sleep was impossible, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. He wondered if the bone carver was watching him even now, its glowing eyes hidden in the shadows. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he clutched the carving tighter, as if it could protect him. When the scream came, it was closer this time, almost deafening in the silence of the night. Jonah leapt to his feet, his heart pounding. It was followed by the sound of laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the village. He grabbed his cloak and rushed downstairs, but the tavern was empty, the fire in the hearth long extinguished. Outside, the streets were shrouded in fog, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. Jonah followed, his breath coming in short gasps. He knew he was walking into danger, but he couldn't stop himself. The bone carver was here, and he had to face it. The fog clung to the streets of Black Hollow like a shroud, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. Jonah moved cautiously, the bone carving clutched tightly in his hand. The laughter he had heard earlier had faded, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against his ears. His footsteps were the only sound, each one echoing as if the village itself were mocking him. He felt eyes on him, but every time he turned, there was nothing but the swirling fog and the faint outline of darkened buildings. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, and his heart pounded in his chest. He reached the source of the scream, a narrow alleyway between two crumbling cottages. The air here was thick with a metallic tang of blood, and the ground was slick with it. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he saw the body. It was a woman, her lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. Her chest had been carved open, her ribs pulled apart to form another grotesque sculpture. The edges of the bones were smooth and polished, the work disturbingly precise. Jonah stumbled back, his stomach churning. The bone carver had struck again, and it was getting closer. The sound of voices behind him made him whirl around. A group of villagers had gathered at the mouth of the alley, their faces pale with fear and anger. They carried lanterns, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. One of them stepped forward, a burly man with a thick beard and a pitchfork in his hand. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Jonah raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "I heard a scream," he explained. "I came to see if anyone needed help." The man's eyes narrowed, and he pointed the pitchfork at Jonah. "You're the one who's been causing this, aren't you? The drifter, always lurking around. We don't want your kind here." Jonah shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "I didn't do this," he insisted. "I'm just trying to figure out who or what is behind it." The villagers murmured among themselves, their distrust becoming more pronounced. Another man stepped forward, his face twisted with suspicion. "We found that carving in your room," he said, holding up the bone sculpture Jonah had taken from the fisherman. "You've been carrying it around like some kind of trophy. What kind of sick person does that?" Jonah's heart sank. They had searched his room, and now they saw him as a threat. He knew there was no way to convince them otherwise. The crowd grew more agitated, their fear turning into anger. They closed in on Jonah, their lanterns casting grotesque shadows on the walls. He backed away, his mind racing. He could try to fight his way out, but there were too many of them. He could run, but where would he go? The village was a trap, and the bone carver was somewhere out there, watching. As the mob advanced, a voice cut through the chaos. "Stop!" It was Ira, the woman he had spoken to earlier. She pushed her way through the crowd, her expression stern. "This isn't the way," she said. "We need to think, not act in fear." The villagers hesitated, their anger momentarily subdued. Ira turned to Jonah, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and determination. "We need to talk," she said. "Alone." Jonah nodded, gratitude mingling with his unease. The villagers reluctantly dispersed, though their hostile glances lingered. Ira led Jonah away from the alley, her stride purposeful. "You're in danger," she said once they were out of earshot. "They're scared, and scared people do foolish things. You need to leave this village before it's too late." Jonah shook his head. "I can't," he said. "If I leave, the bone carver will just keep killing. I have to stop it." Ira's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "You're brave, but bravery won't save you. The bone carver is something beyond our understanding. You're only human." Jonah clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I can't just do nothing," he said. "People are dying, and I'm the only one who seems to care enough to try and stop it." Ira studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "There's an old woman who lives on the edge of the village," she said. "She knows more about the bone carver than anyone. Talk to her. But be careful, she's not fond of visitors." Jonah nodded, a glimmer of hope cutting through the dread. "Thank you," he said. Ira gave him a small, sad smile. "Don't thank me yet. You're walking into something far more dangerous than you realize." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jonah alone in the fog-shrouded street. He took a deep breath and headed toward the edge of the village, his resolve hardening with every step. The old woman's house was a ramshackle cottage surrounded by twisted trees, its windows dark and foreboding. He hesitated at the gate, the weight of Ira's warning settling over him. The door creaked open before he could knock, and a voice from within called out, "Come in, boy. I've been expecting you." Jonah stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of herbs and decay. The old woman sat in a chair by the fire, her gnarled hands resting on her lap. Her eyes were clouded with age, but they bore into him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "You've come about the bone carver," she said, her voice raspy but sharp. Jonah nodded, unsure of how to begin. The old woman leaned forward, her expression grim. "Sit down," she commanded. I'll tell you what you need to know. But be warned, some truths are better left buried. The old woman's cottage was a labyrinth of shadows and strange objects. The fire in the hearth cast flickering light on shelves cluttered with jars of unidentifiable substances and old, dusty books. Jonah sat across from her, his hands gripping the edge of the worn chair, as she stared into the flames with an unreadable expression. "You've been mocked," she said finally, her voice low and gravelly. Jonah's stomach tightened. "Mocked?" he echoed. The old woman nodded, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "The bone carver doesn't choose its victims at random. There's always a purpose, even if we can't see it." Jonah leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his unease. "What kind of purpose?" he asked. The old woman sighed, her thin shoulders rising and falling with the effort. "It's hard to say," she admitted. "Some believe it's a curse, others that it's a warning. What I do know is this: it's been here before, long ago, when the village was young. It took lives then, just as it's taking them now. The pattern is always the same. The screams, the carvings, the fear. It's as if it's feeding on our despair." Jonah frowned, trying to process her words. "But why does it come back? And how do we stop it?" The old woman turned her gaze to him, her clouded eyes piercing despite their age. "Some say it's tied to the land, that it's awakened when the balance is disturbed. Others think it's drawn to guilt, to those who carry secrets they can't bear to face." Jonah's breath hitched, the memory of his own past rising unbidden. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the old woman's words. "There's a story," she continued, "about the first time it appeared. A man was accused of a terrible crime, but he swore he was innocent. The villagers turned on him, and he vanished into the night. The next morning, his accusers were found dead, their bones carved into grotesque shapes." Jonah's skin prickled, the story hitting too close to home. "So it's a kind of vengeance?" he asked. The old woman shook her head. "Perhaps, but it's more than that. It's a reminder, a lesson that we can't escape the consequences of our actions. Or maybe it's just chaos, a force that thrives on suffering. No one knows for sure." Jonah sat back, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought about the villagers, their fear and suspicion, and wondered if they had somehow brought this upon themselves. But he also knew he couldn't stand by and let more people die. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The old woman studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You can't," she said finally. "Not in the way you're thinking. The bone carver isn't a creature you can fight or trap. It's tied to this place, to the people here. The only way to end it is to break the cycle, to confront the truth it's trying to reveal." Jonah frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. "What truth? I don't even know what's happening here." The old woman's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. "You will," she said. "When the time comes, you'll understand. But be careful, truth can be more dangerous than lies." Jonah left the cottage with more questions than answers, the old woman's warnings echoing in his mind. The fog had thickened, the village now a ghostly silhouette in the haze. He felt the weight of the bone carving in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the danger he was in. As he walked, his thoughts turned to the villagers, their fear, their distrust, their secrets. He wondered if the bone carver was targeting him because of his own guilt, or if he was simply a pawn in a much larger game. Either way, he knew he couldn't run. He had to face this, no matter the cost. The tavern was quiet when he returned, the usual chatter replaced by a tense silence. The barkeeper glanced up as he entered, his expression wary. "You're still here," he said, his tone more statement than question. Jonah nodded, taking a seat at the bar. "I don't have a choice," he replied. The barkeeper hesitated, then poured him a drink. "You're a fool," he said, but there was no malice in his voice. "This village has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out. You'd be better off leaving while you still can." Jonah took a sip of the drink, the bitterness matching his mood. "I can't," he said. "Someone has to stop this." The barkeeper didn't respond, his gaze distant. Jonah studied him, noticing the lines of worry etched into his face. "Do you believe the stories?" he asked. "About the bone carver, I mean." The barkeeper sighed, setting down the glass he'd been cleaning. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted. "But I've seen enough to know that something isn't right here. Maybe it's the bone carver, or maybe it's just us tearing ourselves apart. Either way, it doesn't end well." Jonah nodded, the man's words hitting a nerve. He thought about the old woman's story, about the man who'd been accused and vanished. Could the bone carver be a manifestation of the village's guilt and fear? Jonah spent the rest of the evening in the tavern, nursing his drink and trying to piece together the fragmented truths he'd uncovered. The villagers avoided him, their distrust palpable. He couldn't blame them, he was an outsider, and in a place like Black Hollow, that was enough to make him a suspect. But it also gave him a unique perspective, one that he hoped would help him see what the villagers couldn't. As the night deepened, he retreated to the loft, the bone carving resting on the small table by the bed. He stared at it, the intricate details both beautiful and horrifying. It was a reminder of the lives lost, but also of the mystery he had to solve. Sleep came slowly, his dreams filled with shadows and bone. The morning came with a heavy silence, the village of Black Hollow swallowed by a thick, oppressive fog. Jonah stepped out of the tavern, his breath visible in the cold air, and felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The bone carving was still in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the task ahead. He wandered the streets, his footsteps muffled by the fog, his eyes scanning for any sign of the bone carver or its next victim. The villagers kept their distance, their suspicious glances sharp enough to cut through the haze. Jonah ignored them, his focus sharpening with every step. He found Ira near the docks, her figure partially obscured by the fog. She was standing at the water's edge, staring out at the churning sea. Jonah approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "You're up early," she said without turning, her voice carrying a note of weariness. "I could say the same to you," Jonah replied, coming to stand beside her. Ira sighed, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Not after what happened last night." Jonah nodded, understanding her unease. "Neither could I," he said. "But we can't just wait for it to strike again." Ira turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you plan to do?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, then pulled the bone carving from his pocket and held it up to the light. "This," he said, "it's a clue. The bone carver leaves these for a reason, and I think it's trying to tell us something. If we can figure out what that is, maybe we can stop it." Ira frowned, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carving. "You're playing a dangerous game," she warned. "The bone carver isn't something you can outsmart. It's not human, it's something else entirely." Jonah's grip tightened on the carving. "I know," he said, "but I'd rather try than do nothing." They spent the next few hours combing the village for any signs of the bone carver's presence. The fog made it difficult to see, but Jonah's determination kept him moving forward. Ira stayed by his side, her knowledge of the village proving invaluable. She pointed out places where the bone carver had struck before: an abandoned shed, an old well, the ruins of a church. Each location was marked by a sense of foreboding, as if the land itself remembered the horrors that had occurred there. Jonah felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the bone carver's presence looming larger with every step. As they approached the ruins of the church, Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The building was barely standing, its broken walls covered in moss and ivy. The air here was heavy, the silence almost deafening. Ira stopped at the entrance, her face pale. "This is where it started," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The first victim was found here years ago. It's been abandoned ever since." Jonah stepped inside, his boots crunching on the debris-covered floor. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the cracks in the walls. He could feel the bone carver's presence here, its malevolence almost tangible. They searched the church in silence, their movements careful and deliberate. Jonah's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, looking for any clue that might lead them to the bone carver. As he crouched down to examine a pile of rubble, he noticed something glinting in the dim light. He reached out and pulled it free, his breath catching in his throat. It was a bone, small and delicate, carved into the shape of a key. The details were intricate, the edges sharp and precise. Jonah held it up, his mind racing. "What is it?" Ira asked, her voice tense. Jonah turned to her, his expression grim. "I think it's a message," he said. "A key to something or maybe to someone." As they left the church, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Jonah clutched the bone key, his mind racing with possibilities. The bone carver was taunting him, leading him down a path he didn't fully understand. But he knew he couldn't turn back now. Ira walked beside him, her expression troubled. "This is getting dangerous," she said. "If the bone carver is leaving these for you, it means it's watching you. You're playing into its hands." Jonah nodded, but his resolve didn't waver. "Maybe," he said, "but if it's leading me somewhere, I have to follow. It's the only way to stop it." They returned to the village, the streets still eerily quiet. The villagers had retreated into their homes, the fear of the bone carver keeping them indoors. Jonah and Ira sat in the tavern, the bone key resting on the table between them. The barkeeper brought them drinks without a word, his usual gruffness replaced by a somber silence. Jonah stared at the key, his mind racing. "What do you think it unlocks?" he asked, more to himself than to Ira. She shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't think we'll like the answer." As the day wore on, Jonah's thoughts turned to the bone carver's victims, their fear, their pain, their final moments. He wondered if they had known what was coming, if they had felt the same sense of dread that now clung to him. He thought about the old woman's words, about the bone carver being tied to guilt and secrets. Was it his past that had drawn it to him? Or was it something else entirely? The questions gnawed at him, leaving him restless and uneasy. He knew he was running out of time, that the bone carver would strike again soon. When night fell, the village was shrouded in darkness, the fog obscuring even the faint light of the stars. Jonah sat in the tavern, the bone key resting in his hand. He felt the weight of the bone carver's presence pressing in on him, its malevolence almost suffocating. He knew he couldn't wait any longer, that he had to act before it was too late. He stood, his decision made. Ira looked up at him, her expression filled with concern. "Where are you going?" she asked. Jonah met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "To find it," he said, "before it finds us." The fog clung to the village like a shroud, muffling sounds and obscuring the path ahead. Jonah stepped out of the tavern, the bone key clutched tightly in his hand. The night was eerily quiet, the usual rustle of leaves and distant crash of waves absent. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening as he walked toward the edge of the village. The bone carver was out there, and the key was the only clue he had to confront it. The streets were empty, the villagers having locked themselves away in fear. Jonah's footsteps echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the fog. He followed the path that led to the forest, the trees looming like shadowy sentinels. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper, the mist curling around his ankles. His thoughts drifted to the old woman's warning: truth could be more dangerous than lies. What truth was the bone carver trying to reveal? And what price would he have to pay to uncover it? He pushed the questions aside, focusing on the task at hand. The forest was unnaturally silent, the absence of birdsong or rustling leaves adding to the tension. Jonah's senses were on edge, every shadow a potential threat. As he moved further into the woods, the fog began to thin, revealing a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The ground was soft beneath his feet, the scent of earth and decay filling his nostrils. He noticed strange markings on the trees, deep grooves that seemed to form symbols he couldn't decipher. They reminded him of the bone carving, the intricate patterns both beautiful and unsettling. Jonah paused to examine one of the marks, running his fingers over the rough bark. It felt warm to the touch, as if the tree itself were alive. He shuddered, pulling his hand away. The trail led him to a small clearing, the fog parting to reveal a stone archway covered in moss and ivy. Beyond it stood a crumbling structure, its walls barely standing. Jonah's heart pounded as he approached, the bone key growing heavier in his hand. The archway seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, the air around it thick with tension. He hesitated, the weight of the old woman's warning pressing on him. This was the place the bone carver had led him to, a place of secrets and danger. He took a deep breath and stepped through the archway, the air growing colder as he crossed the threshold. Inside the structure, the walls were covered in carvings that matched the ones on the trees. Jonah held up the bone key, its shape seeming to mirror the symbols around him. The floor was littered with debris, but at the center of the room was a pedestal with a lock that matched the key. His hands trembled as he inserted the key into the lock, the mechanism clicking open with a sound that echoed through the empty space. A hidden compartment within the pedestal slid open, revealing a small, intricately carved box. Jonah lifted it carefully, the wood smooth and cold against his skin. The box was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift under his gaze. He hesitated before opening it, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Inside was a piece of parchment, yellowed with age, and another bone carving, this one shaped like a hand, its fingers curled as if grasping something. Jonah unfolded the parchment, his heart racing as he read the words written in a spidery hand. It told the story of a man who had been wrongfully accused, his life destroyed by the village's fear and ignorance. The man had vanished, but his anger had lingered, taking the form of the bone carver. The realization hit Jonah like a punch to the gut. The bone carver wasn't just a monster, it was the manifestation of a man's rage and despair. The carvings, the killings, the fear, it was all part of a cycle that had been repeating for generations. Jonah's hands trembled as he gripped the parchment, his mind racing. If the bone carver was tied to the village's guilt, then the only way to stop it was to confront that guilt. But how? The villagers had already turned against him, their suspicion making him an outsider. He needed proof, something to make them see the truth. As he stood in the crumbling structure, the air grew colder, and the fog outside seemed to seep into the room. Jonah felt a presence behind him, a malevolent force that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned slowly, his heart pounding. The bone carver stood in the doorway, its skeletal form cloaked in shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Jonah's breath caught in his throat, his grip tightening on the box. The creature didn't move, its presence filling the room with an almost unbearable weight. It was waiting, watching, as if testing him. Jonah's mind raced, the old woman's words echoing in his ears. The bone carver wasn't something he could fight, it was a force tied to the village's guilt, to the secrets they had buried. If he wanted to stop it, he had to face those secrets, no matter how painful. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I know why you're here," he said. "You're not just a killer, you're a warning. But you can't keep doing this. Let me help you end it." The bone carver tilted its head, its expression unreadable. For a moment, Jonah thought it might speak. Instead, the creature vanished, its form dissolving into the fog. The tension in the room lifted, but Jonah knew this wasn't over. The bone carver had shown him the truth, and now it was up to him to act. He left the crumbling structure, the box and parchment clutched tightly in his hands. The fog began to clear as he walked back to the village, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. His mind was clear, his path set. He had to confront the villagers, to make them face the guilt and secrets that had given the bone carver its power. As he approached the village, he saw Ira waiting by the docks, her expression filled with both relief and worry. "You're alive," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened?" Jonah held up the box, his eyes meeting hers. "I found the truth," he said. "But it's not going to be easy. The bone carver isn't just a monster, it's a part of us. If we want to stop it, we have to confront what we've done." Ira's eyes widened, but she nodded slowly. "Then we'll face it together," she said. Jonah felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of light in the darkness. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The village of Black Hollow stirred reluctantly as dawn broke, the fog lifting to reveal the dull light of morning. Jonah stood at the center of the square, the box and parchment in his hands, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. Ira stood beside him, her presence a silent show of support. The villagers began to gather, their faces pale and wary, their eyes filled with suspicion. Jonah raised his voice, the words steady despite the tension in the air. "I've found something," he said, holding up the box. "Something that explains why the bone carver is here and how we can stop it." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their distrust palpable. A man stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You're the one bringing this upon us," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "We should have driven you out the moment you arrived." Jonah met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I didn't bring this here," he said firmly. "But I know what did, and it's not what you think. The bone carver isn't just some monster. It's tied to this village, to the secrets we've buried." The crowd fell silent, their anger giving way to unease. Jonah took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He opened the box, revealing the bone hand and the parchment, and began to read the words aloud. The story of the wrongfully accused man filled the square, his tale of betrayal and despair echoing through the quiet morning. As Jonah spoke, the villagers' expressions shifted. Some looked stricken, others defiant. But all of them listened, the weight of the truth settling over them. When he finished, the silence was heavy, the air thick with unspoken guilt. Jonah closed the box, his voice calm but firm. "We can't keep running from this," he said. "If we don't confront our past, the bone carver will keep coming." For a moment, no one moved. Then an elderly woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I remember him," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The man you're talking about. He lived here long before any of you were born. He was kind, but the village turned on him when a child went missing. They said he was responsible, but there was no proof. He denied it, but they wouldn't listen. Her words hung in the air, the truth cutting through the lies like a knife. Other villagers began to murmur, their voices filled with shame and regret. Ira stepped forward, her expression determined. "This isn't just about him," she said. "It's about us. We're the ones who keep letting fear and suspicion turn us against each other. If we want to stop the bone carver, we need to change." The crowd murmured again, but this time the tone was different. There was a spark of hope, a willingness to confront the truth. Jonah felt a glimmer of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. The bone carver was a force tied to their collective guilt, and breaking its hold on the village wouldn't be easy. As the villagers began to disperse, their faces thoughtful, Ira turned to Jonah. "You've given them something to think about," she said. "But what now? How do we make this right?" Jonah glanced at the box in his hands, his expression grim. "We need to show the bone carver that we're ready to face the truth," he said. "But it's not going to let us go without a fight." As the day wore on, the village began to change. The fear and suspicion that had divided them slowly gave way to a fragile unity. People spoke openly about their past mistakes, their voices filled with regret but also determination. Jonah watched from the edge of the square, his thoughts heavy. He knew the bone carver was still out there, watching, waiting. It had shown him the truth, but it wasn't done yet. The box and parchment were only the first step. The final confrontation was still to come. He felt Ira's hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You've done more than anyone else could," she said. "But this isn't over, is it?" Jonah shook his head, his gaze distant. "No," he said. "It's not over. The bone carver is tied to this village, but it's also tied to me. I think it's been waiting for someone like me, someone who's carried their own guilt, their own secrets." Ira's expression softened, but her grip on his arm tightened. "Then we'll face it together," she said. Jonah nodded, gratitude mingling with his unease. "Thank you," he said, "but I can't ask you to put yourself in danger." Ira shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "You're not asking. I'm choosing." As night fell, the village was quiet, the tension replaced by a sense of purpose. Jonah and Ira walked toward the edge of the forest, the box and bone key in their hands. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Jonah's heart pounded as they approached the clearing, the stone archway looming in the darkness. He could feel the bone carver's presence, its malevolence pressing in on him. He turned to Ira, his voice steady. "Stay close," he said, "and no matter what happens, don't let go of the truth." Ira nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. They stepped through the archway, the air growing colder with every step. The bone carver was waiting, its skeletal form cloaked in shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Jonah held up the box, his voice strong despite the fear coursing through him. "We know the truth," he said, "and we're ready to face it. But this has to end." The bone carver tilted its head, its expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then it stepped forward, its bony hand reaching out as if to touch the box. Jonah held his ground, his heart racing. This was the moment of reckoning, the final confrontation that would decide the fate of the village and his own. The bone carver's hand hovered over the box, its skeletal fingers twitching as if uncertain. Jonah stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he held his ground, his grip on the box steady. He could feel Ira beside him, her presence a silent anchor in the chaos. The air around them grew colder, the fog thickening until it seemed to swallow everything but the three of them. The bone carver's glowing eyes fixed on Jonah, its gaze piercing through the darkness. It didn't speak, but its presence seemed to echo with unspoken questions, demands, and warnings. Jonah took a deep breath, his voice trembling but firm. "We've faced the truth," he said. "The village knows what happened, and they're ready to make it right. You don't have to keep this cycle going. Let it end here." The bone carver tilted its head, its expression inscrutable. For a moment, it seemed to consider his words, the tension in the air nearly unbearable. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its claws raking through the air. Jonah instinctively stepped back, raising the box as a shield. The bone carver's hand struck the box, the impact sending a shockwave through the clearing. The force of the blow sent Jonah stumbling, the box slipping from his grip and clattering to the ground. The bone carver loomed over him, its skeletal form towering and menacing. Ira shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos, but the creature ignored her, its focus entirely on Jonah. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. This wasn't working. The bone carver wasn't responding to words or reason. It was a force of rage and despair, and it wasn't going to stop unless they found another way. Jonah's eyes darted to the box, lying just out of reach. He needed to reach it, but the bone carver was blocking his path. Ira moved before he could act, darting forward and grabbing the box. The bone carver turned its head, its glowing eyes locking onto her. She held the box tightly, her expression defiant despite the fear in her eyes. "You've had your vengeance," she said, her voice steady. "But it's time to let go. This isn't the way." The bone carver stepped toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Jonah's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his mind desperately searching for a plan. He couldn't let Ira face this alone, but he didn't know how to stop the creature. Before the bone carver could reach Ira, a voice rang out from the edge of the clearing. It was the elderly woman from the village, her frail figure silhouetted against the fog. "Leave them alone," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You've punished us enough. We know what we did, and we're ready to face it. But this has to end." The bone carver turned its head slowly, its gaze shifting to the woman. Jonah and Ira exchanged a glance, the tension in the air shifting. Other villagers began to appear, their faces pale but resolved. They stepped forward one by one, forming a circle around the clearing, their presence a silent show of unity. The bone carver's head turned, its glowing eyes scanning the faces around it. For the first time, it seemed uncertain, its movements hesitant. Jonah stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's over," he said. "You've made your point. Now it's up to us to do better to make sure this never happens again." The bone carver's form began to waver, the shadows that cloaked it thinning as if it were losing its hold on the world. It turned back to Jonah, its gaze lingering for a moment before it let out a low, mournful howl. The sound echoed through the clearing, sending a chill down Jonah's spine. As the howl faded, the bone carver's form began to dissolve, its skeletal body breaking apart into wisps of shadow and mist. The fog in the clearing thinned, the air growing warmer as the creature's presence faded. Jonah watched, his heart heavy but relieved, as the last traces of the bone carver vanished. The villagers stood in silence, their faces filled with a mix of awe and regret. The elderly woman stepped forward, her hands clasped together. "It's done," she said softly. "Now it's up to us to honor his memory, to make sure we never repeat the mistakes of the past." Jonah and Ira stood together, the box still clutched in her hands. The weight of what had just happened settled over them, the enormity of it almost overwhelming. Jonah felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. The bone carver was gone, but its legacy would remain, a reminder of the consequences of fear and ignorance. He turned to Ira, his voice quiet. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled faintly, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "We did it together," she said, "and now we have to move forward." As the villagers began to disperse, their voices low and somber, Jonah and Ira stayed in the clearing. The weight of the past still hung over them, but there was also a sense of hope, a belief that the village could heal, that they could learn from their mistakes. Jonah glanced at the box in Ira's hands, his thoughts turning to the bone key and the secrets it had unlocked. It was a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth facing. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The village of Black Hollow awoke to a stillness that felt alien after weeks of fear and tension. The fog that had clung to the streets like a shroud had lifted, leaving behind a crisp, clear morning. Jonah stood at the edge of the forest, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the trees. The memory of the bone carver's final moments played in his mind, the haunting howl still echoing in his thoughts. He knew the village was safe now, but the weight of what had happened lingered, a heavy reminder of the cost of truth and redemption. Ira appeared beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "You've done something incredible," she said, her voice soft but warm. "The village won't forget this." Jonah shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. The bone carver didn't go because of me, it went because we all faced the truth together." Ira nodded, her gaze drifting to the forest. "Still, it's going to take time for things to feel normal again," she said. Jonah sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Normal might not be possible," he admitted. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Sometimes breaking the cycle means starting over." They walked back to the village together, the streets slowly coming to life as people ventured out of their homes. The fear that had once defined the community was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. Villagers greeted Jonah with quiet nods or murmured thanks, their gratitude unspoken but sincere. He returned their gestures with a small smile, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The bone carver was gone, but its legacy remained, a reminder of the consequences of fear and ignorance. Jonah knew the village would carry that lesson forward, but he couldn't help wondering if it would be enough. In the square, the elderly woman who had spoken up in the clearing was addressing a small group, her voice steady and strong. "We've been given a chance to make things right," she said. "Let's not waste it." The villagers listened intently, their faces filled with determination. Jonah and Ira stood at the edge of the group, watching silently. After a moment, Ira turned to Jonah. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I'm not sure," he said. "I came here looking for answers, but I found more than I bargained for. Maybe it's time to move on." Ira's expression softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "You're leaving?" she asked. Jonah nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "There's nothing more for me here. But I'll always remember this place and the people who helped me face the bone carver." Ira smiled faintly, though her voice carried a note of regret. "You'll be missed," she said. "But I understand. Sometimes you have to follow your own path." Jonah returned her smile, a sense of gratitude filling him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." As the day wore on, Jonah made his quiet preparations to leave. He packed his belongings, his movements slow and deliberate. The village felt different now, the weight of the bone carver's presence replaced by a sense of hope. He knew the people of Black Hollow would carry the lessons they'd learned forward, just as he would carry the memories of this place with him. When he was ready, he stepped out of the tavern, his bag slung over his shoulder. The square was quiet, the villagers going about their daily lives with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Ira was waiting for him by the edge of the village, her hands clasped in front of her. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jonah nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and take care of this place. It deserves a better future." Ira smiled, though her eyes were glistening. "I will," she said, "and if you ever find yourself back this way, you'll always have a place here." Jonah reached out, clasping her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." He turned and walked down the road that led out of the village, the weight of his journey settling over him. The forest loomed ahead, its trees tall and silent. Jonah took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and felt a sense of resolve. The bone carver was gone, but its legacy would remain, a reminder of the power of truth and the cost of facing it. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew he was ready to face them, not because he was unafraid, but because he understood the importance of confronting the darkness, both within and without. As he disappeared into the trees, the village of Black Hollow faded behind him, its streets and people becoming a distant memory. Jonah's mind turned to the road ahead, the possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he would carry the lessons of Black Hollow with him. The bone carver had taught him that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth facing. And as he walked into the unknown, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a belief that, no matter what lay ahead, he was ready to face it. The forest stretched endlessly, its trees standing like silent sentinels as Jonah made his way down the worn path. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth filling his lungs. He walked steadily, his bag slung over his shoulder, his thoughts quiet but focused. The events of Black Hollow lingered in his mind, the memory of the bone carver and the village's redemption a constant undercurrent. He knew he was leaving behind more than just a place. He was leaving behind a piece of himself, a part of his journey that had changed him forever. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The sun broke through the canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. Jonah paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the woods around him. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive fog of Black Hollow, the clarity of the light and air a reminder of the new beginning he was stepping into. He took a deep breath, the weight of his journey settling over him. Though the bone carver was gone, its lessons remained, a guide for the road ahead. Jonah knew the path wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had the strength to walk it no matter where it led. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the people he'd left behind. Ira's face appeared in his mind, her quiet strength and unwavering support a source of comfort. He hoped she would find the peace and happiness she deserved, that the village of Black Hollow would continue to heal and grow. He thought of the elderly woman who had spoken up in the clearing, her courage a reminder that even the smallest voice could make a difference. And he thought of the bone carver, its final moments a haunting reminder of the cost of truth and redemption. These memories would stay with him, a part of his story that he would carry forward. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open fields bathed in sunlight. Jonah stepped out of the woods, the wide expanse of the horizon stretching before him. The road ahead was long and winding, but he felt a sense of clarity and purpose that he hadn't known before. He knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt and fear, but he also knew he was ready to face them, not because he was unafraid, but because he understood the importance of confronting the darkness, both within and without. The bone carver had taught him that, and he would carry that lesson with him always. As he walked down the road, the sun warm on his face, Jonah felt a sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his journey no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a promise, a reminder that every step forward was a chance to grow and change. He didn't know where the road would take him, but he knew he was ready to follow it, to embrace the unknown and all it had to offer. The lessons of Black Hollow would guide him, but his path was his own, a journey of discovery and redemption that he would walk with courage and determination. The miles passed quietly, the landscape shifting as Jonah made his way forward. He passed through small villages and rolling hills, the world around him a tapestry of beauty and life. Each step brought him closer to a future he couldn't yet see, but one he was ready to meet. The bone carver was behind him, its legacy a shadow that no longer held him captive. Instead, it had become a part of his story, a reminder of the power of truth and the strength it took to face it. Jonah knew he was changed by what he'd experienced, and he was grateful for it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Jonah found a small clearing by the roadside. He set down his bag and sat on a fallen log, watching the colors of the sky shift and change. The quiet of the evening settled around him, the sounds of the forest a peaceful backdrop to his thoughts. He felt a sense of gratitude for the journey he'd been on, for the people he'd met, and for the lessons he'd learned. The bone carver had taught him the importance of facing the truth, and he would carry that with him always. The stars began to appear, one by one, their light piercing the darkening sky. Jonah lay back on the soft grass, his hands behind his head, and watched as the night unfolded above him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he felt a sense of calm and readiness that he hadn't known before. He knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, fear, and struggle, but he also knew he had the strength to face them. The bone carver was behind him, its shadow no longer a weight on his shoulders. Instead, it had become a part of his story, a guide for the journey ahead. As he drifted off to sleep beneath the stars, Jonah felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was unknown, but he was ready to walk it with courage, determination, and an open heart. The lessons of Black Hollow would stay with him, a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of redemption. And as he closed his eyes, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, not because he was unafraid, but because he understood the importance of confronting the darkness, both within and without.